Welcome to Some Joyful Noises, a music podcast with no rhyme, rhythm, or reason. This show is a proud member of the Anazal Podcast Network. The reason we do this show is for community, not because any of us are music experts, but rather because we believe that music helps shape community, and that's something that's really important to all of us at the Anazal Podcast Network. I'm Josh Windle. I am the producer of this show. I say producer and not host because this show has no host. It has no schedule. It has no format. You are just as much the host as I am. If you would like to find out how you could lead your own episode of Some Joyful Noises, then listen to the end of the show for an invitation to lead your own conversation on this podcast. We hope you enjoy this show with no rhyme, no rhythm, and no reason.
All right, what's up, everybody? Happy Halloween. Welcome to a special spooky edition of Some Joyful Noise. I am one of your guest hosts for today's frightening festivities. I am Joe Day. I am the host of the Thoughts from a Bearded Geek YouTube channel, as well as Shell Shock, a TMNT series, and what feels like about 87 other shows. Producer Josh approached me about doing an episode based around Halloween music, horror music, and the whole nine yards, and there was but one man that came directly to mind to join me for today's conversation. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Howdy, my name is Josh, or as some of you may know me, Captain Nostalgia if you've followed me for a long time. I am the 1/3 of the co-host for Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast that talks about the intersection of all things spooky and mental health, and also the founder of the Victims and Villains nonprofit that is a multimedia nonprofit that essentially talks about mental health through pop culture and what pop culture teaches us about mental health and so on and so forth.
That's the just to plug your stuff real quick, man. As I became a pastor, it really dawned on me. Like, I've been a longtime horror fan since inarguably too young, but the more time that I spend as a pastor, the more I've really come to appreciate the side of horror that allows folks to be able to address the realities of life, good, bad, and indifferent, through the lens of an avatar, through the safety of being able to see somebody else go through those things. And hopefully it can stimulate some conversation that helps to be able to process and to shine some light on what are really dark subjects.
One of the soundtracks I'll bring up later on in the show belongs to a movie that means the world to me. And so part of the reason that I got into mental health advocacy is because I had a friend die by suicide. And that entire first year, I found kinship in not only the Lord, but also with a horror movie in particular that was new at the time. And has since kind of become one of my favorite films of all time, if not my favorite. And I just found a lot of a lot of processing and a lot of healing and a lot of the importance of being open about trauma and how healing is this non-linear journey, even though we try and make it to be. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of like, that was like my entry point into like this experience for myself to be like, oh, this actually is a thing where healing can begin, and I can identify with these other character stories and kind of see myself as a reflection at the same time.
Yeah. There's so much there's so much that can be said just on the horror genre alone when it comes to that. But we are here to talk music. And we are here to talk about music of the time. And I feel like I need to start this off with a confession of sorts. My wife and I may, in fact, have a curated playlist on Pandora of Halloween music, bro. This is like legit. Every year we have this channel on our Pandora programmed and goes through everything from horror movie soundtracks to just themes from the season, you know?
That's awesome. I go through like waves.
Yep.
And I'm a Spotify user, and Spotify does that like thing every year. Like, this is your most listened to artist. And I want to say it was 2 years ago. My top one was John Carpenter. So I'm no stranger to this. And Carpenter is a maestro to me. So
seriously, like for the way that I personally view Wes Craven for horror directing is exactly how I view John Carpenter from the musicality side of horror movies. Like, you talk about a dude that revolutionized. Oh, phenomenal.
Oh yeah, I'll have visual aids throughout the course of this. I do hope that this gets a video plug. It's not just audio.
Yeah, it'll be video as well. Yeah, that is awesome. So yeah, I think I've always been aware of the immersion factor of horror and the holiday as a whole, Halloween as a whole, because I think I can date it outside of just horror movies and stuff like that. But even like, especially now that I've gotten more into the artistic side of music, a couple of years ago, I started delving into stuff that wasn't just straight up stage performance in the most classical sense, but marrying those worlds of theater, my background in theater, and bringing that forward into music and having it be more of an experience than just listening to specific music. Now I really find myself vibing with a lot of these artists that are taking these anthems of this period of time and bringing an entirely new life to them by adding this other dimension to it, you know?
Yeah, and that's the awesome thing about music is that it essentially like it can transport you back to a time, like even stepping outside of like the horror. Like, I grew up in right outside of Baltimore, and so there was like, you know, a big thing my sister and I did during the summers was like the community pool. Right. And so like every year they would play these, like every summer they would just play like, you know, things like, you know, BB Mac or Macy Gray, or, you know, there's like these like little songs, or I can't remember the name of the Lifehouse. That's the one I was trying to think of. Like, so there's like anthems that like just transport back into time, that where I'm just like, I was, you know, here when I heard this song. Yep. It has those like significant importance, and music is really fascinating to me, the way that it can do that. You know, I can hear the Halloween soundtrack and I can tell you about the first time that I watched that movie, or the Scream soundtrack, and tell you how influential that was for me getting into the rock genre, and ultimately jumping into dissect and get to better know the slasher genre as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that Scream was my entryway into knowing bands like Blue Oyster Cult and getting into more of the alt grunge rock side of that mid to late 90s era of music, because like Scream was my, like, we'll get to it once we get to soundtracks. That's there for me. But yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about music, and one of the beautiful things about a resonant period of time, is whenever you mesh those two things together, you can have a subgenre of music that really brings you to a certain memory, a certain feeling, a certain period of time, or allows you to process through certain things in a unique and different way. Like, and I think that now that we have all of these different avenues, you've got YouTube, you've got podcasting, you've got Spotify, you've got different outlets for artists to be able to create art. I think we've seen such an explosion of holiday centric music that isn't just that conversation living and dying on Christmas music. You know what I mean? And I think it's great because you look at all of these things, and especially looking at things from a Christian point of view, so many of these things have like these holidays have songs centered around them. You've got your Christmas music, you've got your Easter music, you even got 4th of July music. So why shouldn't there also be room at the table for us freaks and geeks that just happen to love spooky season?
Yeah, and the cool thing about that, and even bringing it into a from a perspective of spirituality, right? Like a lot of those like things are uplifting God, but when you're looking at things like scores or films that are the undercoating emotional aspect of a lot of these films that we love and have, you know, shaped us, there's no lyrics, so you can't have that argument of, well, it's not worshiping God. Well, there's no lyrics. Like, it's not doing anything. It's just existing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's exactly the blank canvas that allows us to pour in our own POV. Like, that's so unpopular opinion. I think they should have quit after Halloween 1. I think they got it right in 1. I think that was like the one. There are other good Halloween movies, but I think by a country mile, the best one is the first one. And I think part of that is the blank canvas of Michael Myers coupled with the blank canvas of John Carpenter's score that fits that fall aesthetic that they nailed so well in that movie. You look like you have so many opinions.
I love Halloween. Halloween is my favorite film franchise of all time.
Okay.
So there are ebbs and flows. I definitely agree with you. I think the first one is a very strong one.
Yeah.
It's one of my top 3 in the franchise, and it's probably in my top 3 horror films of all time. So like, I'm not gonna say it, but like, there are so many good things that like those later sequels have given us that have just been fun. I mean, come on, what other film franchise is going to give you Busta Rhymes versus Michael Myers? Like,
so okay, I listened to a podcast that the host was really defending Busta Rhymes and that being an actually like closeted decent movie, and he did such a good job that I'm like, I need to go back and watch this movie. I feel like it's been a while since I've seen that movie.
I go back, and so I always tell people to give it a shot, because when you look at the entirety of Halloween, it is Michael essentially going after his bloodline. It is the one anomaly in the entirety of the franchise. Even when you look at the remake or the legacy sequels that we've gotten in the last 15 years, it is Michael going after his bloodline.
Yeah.
This is the one time that Michael steps outside of that formula and just kills people for the sake of killing people.
Yeah.
A la Jason Voorhees.
Yeah.
And it introduced, like, it was very much like a time period piece, right? Like, and it's wild and it's weird and it's campy, and you don't get that from every entry into the Halloween franchise. And that's part of the reason that I love it. It was one of I saw how the first Halloween, and then like that was probably like the second one I saw.
Yeah.
So for me, it like holds like a lot of nostalgia to it. It's just a goofy time that like I can turn my brain off and just watch or grab a beer and just unwind.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's a not zero chance that I go back and look at it like I do Scream 3. I am an apologist for the entire, like, I'm one of those fans where I'm like, even the worst of the Scream franchise is still a Scream movie and by de facto good. So I can see how people get there. That being said, though, to the theme, I think that's probably the first score that, like, flat out and out score that sticks out to me. Elm Street might be the only one that contends with that, because Elm Street was my first love in horror. And so that ethereal, dreamy sort of presence to that one, coupled with the sarcastic, almost grimy aesthetic that it went with, kind of is like, it's like a 1A and 1B sort of conversation for me. But I will say, if you're coupling in fall and you're coupling in nostalgia and all of those feels of AMC Horror Fest, or going out to the local haunted house attraction, or hay rides, or different things like that are associated with fall and spooky season and stuff like that, that conversation, that 100% stops at John Carpenter. He is the one that has that theme that is so closely tied to the season as a whole for me.
Yeah, that piano, that is so iconic.
Yep.
And even, when you listen to the other variations that they've done throughout the course of it, like, the one for Halloween 3 is very synthy. It's very, takes that score, but it's heavier on the synth and kind of that like synth adjacent rock. And then you look at something like H2O, and H2O, it has this very classical, very cinematic, there's a heavy on the strings. And then you also have like the Rob Zombies that kind of took that, but sped it up a little bit. But anyway, you talk about it, like, I would argue that there are two films that kind of define that fall. It would be that one, and I have to give it to Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah.
I think those are the two that you can look at and be like, man, it is like September, it's spooky season, it's ready. Even though we all know spooky season begins July 5th, if we're putting dates on it.
Yep.
But it's year round. It's year round for nerds like us.
Yeah, absolutely. This Is Halloween might be my favorite actual Halloween song. That, to me, and especially because that's like the song that I think of when I think of artists that created entirely new spins on these songs. One is this heavy metal woman that just she does these crazy dirty vocal parts and turns it into this entirely new song, where another one, a couple of guys almost turned it into like a hardcore version of like pop punk and kind of do that spin on it. And both of them work splendidly. It was actually some of the inspiration for me to start to get into that side of music.
I know it's frowned. I know he's frowned upon in Christian circles, but Manson's version of some of those songs too are like freaking incredible.
Yeah. I don't. So I'm one of those types that, even though, like, yes, I have openly stated in this episode alone that I am a pastor. I obviously have a Christian worldview. Josh also has a Christian worldview. All of that sort of jazz. For me, I'll speak for myself on this one. I don't put a lot of stock in this artist is frowned upon, this one is okay, this one, like that kind of compartmentalization, me personally. So I think I personally am of the opinion that if you can like have some level of discernment as far as that sort of music goes, I think guys like Manson bring a lot to the conversation. When you're talking about music that can transport people to a time and a place, or music that is about the artistry of it, or is about the experience and performance of it versus just the music component.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I, as a Christian, have never really dove in too much into a lot of his discography. I've given it a chance, you know, here and there. Like, it's not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
He puts out a new album, much like Slipknot. I'll give him a chance. I'm just not a fan. Yeah. I don't know if that means that I lose my rock card. That's cool. It's cool. But you know, I think that when you look at what he's been able to accomplish in terms of his musicality and his abilities, the dude is wickedly talented. Mm-hmm. And I will definitely say that there are, it's not to say that he hasn't written a few genuinely great songs either.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely understand how some folks cannot separate art and artist, and that's okay. I'm not, I think music is one of those things that doesn't have a right or wrong answer a lot of the time. But I just, what he brings is just, it's definitely unique. I think he crawled so that way a lot of the more modern artists and modern artistic expressions of music can walk and run, So what are some sleeper hits for Halloween season that are beyond, we hit the big two, right? I would argue the big three. If you're looking at Halloween music, I do think that Elm Street has a place in the conversation, but I also might be biased. I am absolutely a homer for Freddy. But what ones would you add to that list?
So this is a sleeper hit, and I don't know necessarily if it would fall in this is horror, this is Halloween themed. But for me, I did, one of the activities I did during the pandemic was I'm gonna start looking at franchises that I've tried to look at before, jump into them and dive into them, give them another chance, give them a fresh pair of eyes. And that includes everything from film, if they have TV series, if they have music that goes along with it, really diving into a lot of the scores of these things. And one that I found that is now one of my favorite horror films is Hellraiser. And so I will say Christopher Young probably is one of his, I think it was his first or second film that he ever did. His first film may have been Nightmare 2. But for me, I think that that's definitely a score that I think I deserves way more in terms of because it's this really strange piece of media where it feels whimsical, like a Disney movie, but also at the same time it has these really grand cinematic and very theatrical horns, and the way that it builds, it really does feel like how you would imagine the battle between heaven and hell feeling. Yeah. And that's always been a score that I really love. And even when they remade the movie for Hulu, Ben Levitt, I think, captures that, but also at the same time brings that into a more modern era where there's also this kind of hip-hoppy flair to it in some portions, but yet you have these very drama fueled how do I say piano parts in it as well. It's just all around, I think that but again, it comes back to Christopher Young's score for those first two films. They're just absolutely incredible.
So, okay. Live on the air, I've got a bone to pick with you. And it's dating back. It's dating back to your coverage of of Hellraiser, because this is by the time our paths had already crossed. So I was following what you were doing, and I'm like, oh, this guy's making Hellraiser sound so good, and you're doing it again. You're making Hellraiser sound so compelling, and I went back and watched it, and I'm like, yo, I don't get this. Like, I could not bring myself to, I seriously, people, I cannot tell you for all of the years that I have endured the schlock of both the slasher genre and the paranormal genre, and how much of an apologist that I've been for Paranormal Activity and for the entirety of the Scream franchise, I can 100% appreciate that there's different strokes for different folks. There's different things for everybody. But man, that was like what, an hour and a half to 2 hours that I couldn't get back after watching it.
And that's the great thing about horror, right? Is that everything is going to have someone that's going to grasp it, you know?
Yeah.
And for me, like, I tried probably 4 different times to make it through the first one. I get like 45 minutes into it and be like, this is boring, or I'm not feeling this. And finally, during the pandemic, I was like, I'm going to try and give this another shot. And I don't know what it was. And I don't know if it was like the world coming to an end and like having to deal with, you know, these otherworldly beings. There was just something that clicked on that 5th go round. And I burned through all 10 movies within a week. I listened to all 10 scores, or every score that I could find on streaming. I dug into the comics. I read both of the books. I started like diving into like Clive Barker's bibliography. And I think he's criminally underrated when it comes to him and King. Mm-hmm. Dude is a fantastic writer and exceptional world builder. And I think that for me is like the more that I got into that world and kind of saw how not only different creators would interpret it, especially in the direct-to-video era, but also at the same time how they would take this character and kind of play with what it could be, like what hell is to everyone.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's the thing that, you know, when you think about the heaven and hell, for us, they're like places, but to other people, they're suggested, themes or ideas or realities. And I loved the way that they would kind of play on a lot of that stuff, whether you were talking about the internet age in Hellworld, or, you know, you're talking about actual spiritual warfare for Judgment, or you're bringing him, you know, into space, or this, like, or you're diving into the psychosis of affairs and infidelity. Like, you know, there's so many different things that it could be. And I appreciate everything that they've done, and appreciate that this new one just addresses addiction and the mental health process of trying to be clean and stay clean, and how that reality in and of itself is hell, not only for you, but for the people around you.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those movies that, like, I sell this. I try my best to sell it to a lot of people, but this is one of my hot takes is I love this movie. And I love this movie because it, A, got me through a really hard time when the world was falling apart. Yeah. But B, also, I loved his interpretation of hell, you know, because as Christians, I think that we don't really, it's not a subject we talk about very often.
Right.
And so, we have this very, like, basic view, like, this is what hell is. But I think what Barker does that's so freaking creative is he takes those interpretations and gives a lot of depth to them. And that's part of the reason that I am fascinated by that franchise.
Yeah, I will say, literally, for as much of a fan as I am of King, I really wish that conversation extended out from King more often, because there are so many writers out there that are so talented within the horror genre. And Clive Barker, his first book, the first of the two, I thought was a masterpiece in horror literature, and so I could definitely see the impact of something like that under the right circumstances and for the right mindset. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Barker is one of those ones that like I picked up. I'm like blanking on the author's name, and I can't find the book. I literally had it right on my desk. But Jack Ketchum, that's the guy. Ketchum was a guy that was in the 80s and wrote, he's got a plethora of titles, but the one that I own is The Girl Next Door, which if you know about that movie or you know about that book, it's an extremely tough read.
Yeah.
And I remember getting through that for the first time last year and just being like, why is this like not a name that is like more impressed into the literate conversation of like horror greats from this decade? I think that's why I really appreciated reading. I don't know if you've ever read it, the Paperbacks from Hell from Grady Hendrix.
Yeah.
But, there's so many incredible authors from the horror genre in the 80s that I feel like just kind of got overshined by King's roster of juggernaut titles from that era.
Yeah, I also think that there's a level of unsettledness that King brings versus flat out and out horror that some of the other authors bring that are more intense than some of King's work. I'm not saying none of King's work is intense, because like I said, I love King, but I think there's a level of palatability to his stuff that is more universally acceptable than some of his contemporaries.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about that scene from It. If you know, you know.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So for my sleeper hit of this sort of season, I absolutely love Alfred Hitchcock. I think Alfred Hitchcock is not nearly talked about for the impact that he had and the things that he established and all of that. But one of the strongest components of any of his movies tends to be the soundtrack. The pieces are so resonant that they take you to the first time you saw that scene, or they take you to the movie, and it makes you feel in a way that, for me, in the horror genre, that conversation of just plain orchestrals kind of tends to be John Carpenter and Alfred Hitchcock. So that being said, Psycho, I think, has a killer soundtrack. When you are following Marion Crane through the different scenes that are going on behind her, and it's this anxious moment for her, and she's just done this thing wrong, but she feels like she's doing it for right reasons, and she doesn't know how to square that circle. And then she walks right into the spider's web without realizing it. And, the cut, I've heard cuts between that car scene and they just cut right into the shower scene and like the orchestrals leading up to and coming out of that. And it's such a love letter to that style of cinema,
Yeah, I'm also going to throw into the ring. We were talking about this before we started recording, but I think you and I have different levels that we can handle when it comes to gore.
Yeah.
But for me, I'll also throw in sleeper, but also instantly brings me into this type of year and this type of season.
Yeah,
is going to be Charles Clouser's Saw score. from 2000, I think it was 2004 to 2011, 2012, like you had a new Saw movie that released every October. So much so that the tagline for it used to be, if it's Halloween, it has to be Saw.
Yeah.
Like Lionsgate did such a great job at aligning both of those things that if you grew up on horror in that era, you automatically associate those two things together.
Yeah. I liked the first couple, and then it kind of, for me, went a little off the rails, and I was like, okay, yeah, no, I'm good. But that association that you're talking about, that is an entire generation's like era of horror, and I can appreciate that, even if I don't necessarily like everything that it brought to the table. I can definitely appreciate that time period, that spot on the calendar for a solid chunk of time was defined by that franchise.
Yeah, and I would say that there's no other real franchise, with the exception of Friday the 13th, that was that consecutive with movies. Yeah. When you look at other films like we've talked about thus far, Halloween to Halloween 2, that's 3 years. When you talk about Halloween 2 to Halloween 3, that's, I think it's a year or two. But even when you look at Nightmare 1 to Nightmare 2, it's 2 years, 2 years, and then so on and so forth. So it's like they are the only two franchises that for a long period of time, and majority of their runtime, they were consistent with releasing movies every year, at least once a year, whether that jumped around. I mean, Saw was always October. I can't speak to release dates for Friday the 13th because I think the first one came out in like April 80. And then I don't know which the other two came out. So
yeah, and I will go as far as to say, even though it's not all my favorite, I would say that when you're talking about that consistency, coupled with does it tell a cohesive story, I think Saw that's theirs 1,000%. That and I might be biased because I think I've always said that I think that Friday is the weakest of the big name slasher franchises. Though I will say I do think there is something to be said for their score. I think that score of the ha ha, like I think there's something to it. But when compared to the other names in that conversation, there's a reason why that tends to go down a peg outside of just the sound effect.
And it's also very interesting to consider too, because when you think about the other films that we've talked about, whether you're talking about Halloween, Hellraiser, Nightmare on Elm Street, Saw, they always have, there's two things that each of those franchises, those scores have. One that feels like it has an identity that is associated to that character, and two, that it has a timeless feel to it. You flip that around, and when you look at the score for Friday the 13th, that like that dent, like there's just something about it that just feels very hokey and very 80s by today's standards. Like it definitely feels like a product of its time.
Yeah, for sure. And I got to give it to Betsy Palmer. I think she did an amazing job with the first one. I think the first one, it's one of those movies that it's got a great feel to it, but I think everything outside of that is just, I don't know. It all kind of blends into the woodwork for me. It's all kind of melts together into one giant thing. So one more out of this section that I just, talking about the Halloween stuff, just to go back to the conversation about Nightmare Before Christmas, because I think so much of this, we're talking about horror and, spoilers, we're going to get even deeper into the horror soundtracks conversation and all of that. But I to get a chance to be playing a set that involves songs from Nightmare, and to see a whole generation, because trust me, I am one of them. I was one of those 90s goth kids. I just the only difference between then and now is now I'm 35. No, I'm playing. But it's one of those things that to see the people of the time and then to see all new generations of people just so vibe with that music and to hear their reaction to that, or to be playing like we do, like a medley of some of the different like more popular orchestral pieces and kind of blend them together and that sort of thing. To hear people, oh, I hear that one. Oh, I know that one. Oh, that's that. And to watch the association in people's minds is such a beautiful thing that I think is at the heartbeat of what makes this conversation even havable. Because it almost seems like at one point in time, I feel like we would have gotten scoffed at for trying to talk about an entire genre of music around themes of Halloween or spooky or whatever. But the more time has gone on, I think the more favorably it looks at this whole subgenre, to see that recognition in people's face. And if we mentioned one of yours that you love, awesome. If not, let us know what your favorite ones are, because there's so many of them and each one of them are unique in such a way because there tends to be some kind of backstory behind it, some reason why it's resonant, or some intrinsic tied memory, you know?
Yeah, and it's kind of like almost for like us, you know, being horror, horrorphiles is almost the equivalent of like when you play someone the score to, let's say, like an Avengers movie or Star Wars movie, these films that have spawned franchises that now have, you know, it's now ingrained into it, to where like I saw a video the other day of like someone actually walked down the aisle to the Avengers theme, you know, but we've also seen other ones that have, you know, taken these more like stripped down versions of, like slowed down, I guess is a better term, of, you know, that John Carpenter theme and kind of interwoven it into you know, the mainstay. And I think it's one of those things that, you know, horror, I think it has always been socially like an outcast, you know, to where it's always been looked down upon. And we're starting to see, you know, like we're recording this, 10 days before Halloween. So, but like you're seeing that like there are juggernauts where it's Terrifier 3 is like making like bukus of money at the box office, and Smile 2 just got released and that's making like a lot of, you know, money at the box office. And you look at like movies from like Jordan Peele that are like just cranking out like hit after hit after hit. And I think that, you know, even for like smaller films like, you know, Immaculate or I Saw the TV Globe, there is a hunger and there is a thirst for this. And you could argue also, without going down the rabbit hole, that like it's this tiresome trend of like we're tired of like the same rehashes on things. Like I love Halloween, but if we go back to that franchise, I want to explore the world of Halloween 3. Like how many times are we going to see Michael come back to life? Like, you know, I'll still be there opening night, but like I want to kind of explore a little bit more what that universe.
Yeah, and for the love of everything, we need to make sure to keep it far away from David Gordon Green. I said what I said, but I agree. I was young, and we bought it was a 2-pack, Halloween 2 and Halloween 3. From Sam's Club. I was so confused. I had no idea why Michael was not in the third. I was so confused. But yeah. So on the subject of Halloween, I think we've given John Carpenter all the flowers that he deserves, but because he casts such a huge shadow, I feel like not nearly enough people talk about Mr. Sandman. Mr. Sandman is another one of those songs for me that just transports me back to fall, Halloween as a kid, all that.
Yeah, Mr. Sandman has this I couldn't agree more. It has this like way of just transporting you back.
Yep.
And I think it's crazy how many people I've met over the years that associate that with the first film.
Yep.
And it plays in the second film, but because those films are so closely linked together,
yep,
and because they are essentially one large story, like you can't help but associate them with both films.
Yeah.
But it is one of these things that it feels like it embodies fall. Like every time I feel like I hear that song, like it's just like I'm ready to like, you know, get a coffee, grab a hoodie and sit out on my balcony and just watch leaves hit the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead. You know, we've been talking about it. We've been talking about horror in the midst of the whole Halloween thing. And I think that it begs to have that part of the conversation as well about the power of horror movie soundtracks on just, I think, people in general, but you know, adding this extra layer to a movie, right? And I think some of the best add that extra layer of storytelling where, yes, the actions and the dialogue and the scenes are all playing out in front of you, but there's this other actor in the room and it's the soundtrack that's playing, or it's what you turn on afterwards and kind of process through what's happened, like what you just watched, while also like taking in the soundtrack from it. So what turned you on to the power of horror soundtracks, and what are some of your go-tos?
So I think one of them we've already talked about, and that would be Scream. Scream has an incredible soundtrack. I'll throw The Craft in there. I think that has an incredible soundtrack that does not get talked about nearly enough. But for me, there are one of the ones that I really like. So like my pandemic activities, also the first half of the pandemic was David Lynch. The second half was Hellraiser. The Lost Highway is one that I will throw out there as just an incredible soundtrack. David Bowie, Nine Inch Nails, Smashing Pumpkins, Lou Reed, Angelo Badalamenti from the Twin Peaks fame, Rammstein. It's such this like weird, like intricate, like blend of beautiful, like 1950s, like classic like radio hits, but like also this like industrial rock.
Yeah.
And it just works so well. And having the score from Angelo Badalamenti woven into the transitions of all those genres really like makes it like one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. I don't own many soundtracks on vinyl. This is one of two that I own.
Yeah.
So it does mean a lot. I really, really enjoy that one.
Yeah. So Scream. I'll tell you what. You want to identify every single solitary person in a crowd who's over 30. You hit those first couple notes of Youth of America and watch, because you're going to find all the people who are intimately aware of what song is about to play. That was my first. Everybody remembers their first. And that for me was my first album, the cover to cover album soundtrack from a movie that just had me. Red Right Hand, Youth of America. It was such a time capsule while also being music that was standalone good. Like I remember it being by itself really good music. I mean, the cover that they did for Don't Fear the Reaper. There's like, I like Blue Oyster Cult. Like, they're not like my favorite or anything, but like I can appreciate the original. But for me, that's my go-to. That's my favorite rendition of the song, because it is slowed down, because it is way bluesier, way more like just it makes you feel in a way that I don't think the original does.
And there's something like that, like when you hear something familiar slowed down, it just automatically becomes creepier.
Yeah.
I remember the first time watching Jordan Peele, the trailer for Jordan Peele's Us, and that song, I Got Five on it, and just the way they slowed it down, I was like, I've never heard this song before. And I listened to the original, like after the trailer, I was like, oh, it's got a good beat, it's got a good groove to it, but you slow it down and it just instantly becomes creepier.
Yes.
And I love it when when movies will feature something familiar, but like done in like a more horror-esque or horror adjacent kind of vibes, and that slowing it down definitely is the way to do it.
Yeah, for sure. My entryway into thinking about things in terms of that and how those things can affect what you're watching and how you process was actually Pink Floyd's The Wall. I have many memories of showing that movie to people in a variety of different contexts. We'll leave it there. If you've ever watched the movie, I'm sure you can figure it out. I was in college. That movie really changed how I viewed soundtracks and like the performance piece of it. And that was a huge thing that came out of it, was some of the stuff in the actual like movie component of it is so distorted and it's off from what the actual album music is, that it was kind of my first look at, oh, so for the sake of the movie, this is somebody changing it from the original and providing a new version of this song.
Yeah. And I'll jump in to like add another one for the conversation. I talked about this earlier in the episode, but for me, there's one film that is like kind of as cheesy as it says, rewritten my life. Because I was 17 when I lost a friend to suicide, and it like really messed me up. Having them die by suicide, and lo and behold, 8 months after his 7 months, almost 8. After his death, Rob Zombie gave us Halloween 2. And I found a lot of just catharsis in a lot of these character journeys. And so this, for me, is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. When you talk about horror films, because it's got this blend of like 70s and like a really moving score, but also at the same time, it was the first introduction that I had to rockabilly. And the first time that I'd ever actually kind of experienced this, like, not quite country, but not quite like blues style of music. And it just blended that really well. And the fact that this was like an EP that was written for the movie is kind of cool. And it's one of my, I get it, it's not everyone's cup of tea. I understand the divisiveness surrounding this movie, but I think the score for it, is really cool. It gave me a really, even stepping outside of the horror, it really gave me a love and new appreciation for a lot of those songs that like my grandparents had when they were raising my parents, and things that I kind of overlooked when they were here with me.
So I'm glad that Rob Zombie came up, because if you didn't bring him up, I was going to bring him up. So
That's fair.
so my version of what you're talking about is the soundtrack to House of a Thousand Corpses. So
That's a great one.
I used to be far more into like, or at least far more forgiving of gore and that side of things. And so I remember when House of a Thousand Corpses came out, and it was like the taboo thing to see. So of course, anybody during that period of time was, all about going to try to see it and all of that. And I too was introduced to rockabilly by way of Zombie. Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And that was, I thought it was cool that there were songs on the CD that you got the reference if you watched the movie. The song was very clearly written for the movie. And so some of it was good standalone music, but other ones were just like they were written for the movie that was put out.
Which I miss so much. I was talking recently with a friend of mine, and like we talk a lot of music. I miss the days of like having music that was specifically written for a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. I think because there's only so many times that for me anyway, I should say, there's only so many times that I can hear like a pop 40 song, whatever, like if it's a pop 40 song from the 70s, it doesn't need to be modern, but like a popular song or a well-known song recontextualized into a new cinematic environment. For me, it's a lot easier to miss when you're using like a radio song than it is to have a song that's written around the movie. Because for me, and I kind of get the vibe that you might be at least in a similar boat. I'm really for creator content. Like I'm really for independent self-expression, swing for the fences, put your everything behind it, whatever it is, do the art that you are like that you feel in your soul. I don't care if I like it or not. Make the art that you feel in your soul. And I think part of that is making music to go to put lyrics to somebody else's piece of art, or if you are, connected to the movie and you're doing both like a John Carpenter, something like that, then great. But making something that is uniquely for that vision, that time, that experience, I could not agree with you more. That's why I was late to the whole Ice Nine Kills party. I did not know who they were at first. And then somebody showed me them. That was their cover of Walking on Sunshine. That was the first song that I had heard from them. And after that, I was like, oh, this is just somebody making the art that they really want to make and killing it, doing it. So I can appreciate, though I can't tell you that I'm like super knowledgeable in the score for Halloween 2. I can appreciate that there was an earnest aspect to that movie, even if it's a movie that that doesn't necessarily vibe with me,
That is one thing I will say about Rob Zombie as a filmmaker, because I do feel like he's a divisive filmmaker. You know, you either really love him or you really hate him. Uh-huh. I am on the boat that I will always give him a chance. Yeah. I think that there are movies of his that I've seen that I've hated. And then there are movies of them like Halloween 2 that have like deeply impacted my life.
Yeah.
And but say what you will about him as a director, he knows having that background in music really works for him because he knows how to create a moment specifically with scoring and music. Like the Halloween 2 ending with The Love Hurts by Nan Vernon is still to this day one of my favorite endings. Like, it's just so haunting. And the fact that you have that juxtaposed to like all of these incredibly violent imagery from both films, done in this sepia tone, is just terrifyingly, like, it sticks with you.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks volumes to how he is as a filmmaker, you know? And I think about like his follow-up to this one being Lords of Salem. It's this really weird, but also like it demonstrates the power of music and brings that power about how music isn't just something you listen to. It's something that affects you in your mental health, in your physical health, and into your core.
Yeah. Again, say what you will about his contractual obligation, it would seem, to have his wife in every single one of his movies. She also being like, you know, the wife of Rob Zombie and being in the music scene and all of that, knows how to play off of music. No, like there are some where you can view it as almost as two separate pieces of the puzzle, right? You've got the movie and you've got the soundtrack. Both can be great, but they're not necessarily really interwoven with each other. There's such a vibe there with his stuff of when you're going to have these musical intersections, or if they've established it beforehand, her getting that and getting the musicality of it, her acting reflects those beats almost at a tempo level of the beat of the music that's happening, that she is moving in her acting is reflecting the beats of the music as well. That, again, like him or not, and there's plenty of examples of both that would justify both positions, you can't help but acknowledge the way that he specifically pulls music in and makes it such a vital component to the overall presentation of his work. Because I've heard interviews of his where he talks about the soundtrack for House of a Thousand Corpses being an extension of the movie in a way that it's supposed to draw you to those moments. It's supposed to be gritty and dark and grimy and take you to being in this environment with these crazy rednecks that just everything, it does have this grime over top of it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think with that one, and then like even stepping back into the world of scores, like that's something that, for as little as you would say about it, Texas Chainsaw Massacre score also has that same feel, same grind to it. And like I think again it goes back to that. It goes back to the vision of the storyteller. You know, you want that. You know, I know we keep bringing them up, but like there are like scene by scene like videos, essays that have been done out there on the importance of music. Whereas like you present a scene from Halloween with music, and then you see that same scene without music, it completely changes the dynamic, completely changes the intensity or the anxiety or the worry that you feel as the viewer for Laurie or the kids, or, you know, for whatever victim he's chasing in that moment. And I think the same can be said about, you know, Zombie. I think, you know, as he's making films today, like he's not as frequent as he's doing it. You know, there's definitely spaces in between each one that he's doing, but he's continuing to bring films that their music feels like an extension of the story that is being told on screen. And that is what movie soundtracks and scores should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to go back to the Halloween conversation of how things can, how certain movies, certain soundtracks can transport you to that fall feel, to that time period and all of that. Likewise, horror soundtracks can bring you to that time, that place, that emotion, and I think uniquely, horror is something that can help somebody continue to process even after what they've watched, right? We talked about how powerful horror can be with helping people to address very real tragedy or situation or circumstance. Well, part of that is that what do you do with all of this? You've been on this wild ride for the last 90 minutes, 120 minutes plus whatever. And you've literally had somebody go through and tear off scabs or address all of these pain points or go straight to a very specific topic of conversation that's so uncomfortable or so resonant. And I think the power of the music that's associated with it is it can help almost like in a situation light. Like you're in the thick of it as you're watching the movie, but afterwards you kind of get to have a weaned off approach of you're still getting those beats of addressing it, but through a lens that's like kind of not as intense as the actual movie.
I know we keep bringing it back up, but that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about the Halloween franchise is that the Halloween franchise, for as much as my co-host Mark will joke around, it is this like choose your own adventure, but it's this only like through line of, you kind of get to see how this one singular night affected all of these people, and most famously we go after Laurie Strode, but when you look at like H2O, you're getting to see how it's affecting her, now she's a functioning alcoholic essentially.
Yeah.
And then you look at the David Gordon Green and she's, been estranged from her granddaughter and daughter. She's like isolation. She knows like everything about like guns and like practices on them daily. And so you get to have this vantage point, and the score for both of those are incredible because it allows you to kind of get to step into the emotional state and the process with that character, to where when you look at H2O on its own, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're going through like a functioning alcoholic's journey. It feels more or less like you're kind of going after like John and the kids and the LL Cool J, Ronnie's arc throughout the course of that. And so you're kind of going for a lot of those, like, I Know What You Did Last Summer or Scream vibes, a lot of the things that were like really popular at that time. But when you look at what they're able to craft with the 2018 version, it's not just Laurie's story anymore. It's her daughter, it's her granddaughters, and you're kind of seeing these three generations of Strode and how this singular moment and that trauma has kind of trickled down throughout the generations. And I think that's a concept worth addressing, that if trauma isn't dealt with in a healthy manner, then it has the ability to not only affect the next generation, but, a generation or two after you.
Yeah. Yeah. So you brought up H2O, and that's one of those, like you were talking about with Halloween 2, that's one of those scores for me that was there at the right time. The movie was there at the right time. All of that resonated hard with Josh Hartnett's character. And a movie that addresses generational trauma and substance abuse and running away from the past and allowing that to damage the present and affect the future. The H2O walked so that way 18 could run in that particular regard. I think, I know I made the joke about David Gordon Green before, but out of the three, I think 18 really hits that note so well that for me, that's the one out of the three of them that I'm like, yes, that this movie gets these themes that are trying to be conveyed through the Laurie Strode character to her. And I would argue that because you get to see it through generations, the more fleshed out version is 18, but I was that age when H2O was out. I was like, all of it was like bang, right at the right time, right at the right spot. And so for me, when I hear that particular score, it's bigger than just the movie for me. It transports me to a place of acknowledging the themes and being able to almost sit comfortably in the mess of the topic. Because if you're a child of abuse or a child of substance abuse or any of those kinds of things, anybody who hears this knows it's not a thing that you close the chapter on. It has an impact on you. It has an impact on how you do relationships, how you do life, all of that sort of stuff. Even if it doesn't always haunt you, it still has borne an impact on you. And that soundtrack, because of all of the other stuff, right? Because of the time and the place and the fact that, yeah, you're right. It very much was Scream meets Halloween in a lot of regards. So even that aspect of it was very favorable for me and all of that. It's this time capsule of a time that allows me to be able to enter into a mindset of thinking through that stage of my life in a way that I'm not sure any other score has been able to achieve.
Yeah, for as campy as that movie is, by today's standards, and I just rewatched it a few months ago, so I feel like I can say that confidently.
Yeah,
those are the notes that really do hit. I think they get a lot of the scores in that franchise, and much like a lot of the horror franchises that we've talked about, you know, a lot of them kind of are variations on the score from the original film, the film that kind of started it all. But when you look at specifically that one, because I also too, I had, my dad battled substance abuse off and on as a kid. And I mean, it still to this day has, I don't want to say had lasting effects. It's definitely had an impact on our relationship, but there's something that is almost like typically we've talked about like a lot of like the teen slashers around that day. When you also look at a lot of these like really prestigious films that aren't necessarily in the horror genre, but are telling similar stories in the drama department, a lot of them had these really moving, really deep and cinematic emotional like riffs and sweeps the way that they would come in. And I think that between the rock music element and those like more prestigious elements, the score for H2O felt like it hit those really well and hit those just blend those emotions extremely well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're looking at something like cinematic music or specific resonant themes in music, then you have to make room in the conversation to allow the beats to become as big as the topic, because the topic is huge. Like, you're talking about some of the core traumas that somebody can experience that has an impact and all of that has lasting effects. So it almost in a way allows you to feel like you're approaching this huge topic with something as equally as big when you have these larger than life cinematic-esque soundtracks.
Absolutely. And for a content creator that takes those kind of concepts of these very larger than life stories, whether you're talking about fantasy, you're talking about horror, or whatever genre you're talking about, or whatever fandom you're into, and bringing them down to talk about these very intimate, emotional concepts. So whether it be mental health or anxiety or suicide or depression, looking at them through those lenses, I think oftentimes we discount the state that a score can have on our emotional being.
Yep.
There are, I talked about, Halloween too, but like probably one of my favorite soundtracks of all time is Hans Zimmer's Man of Steel. Like that is a score that has just stuck with me. It's inspired me. It's uplifted me. Yep. It was a part of my wedding. Like,
that's awesome.
It's one of those things that, like, I think, I don't know if I would, it sounds cliche, I don't know if I would necessarily be the person I am today without it, but it's one of those, I don't think I'd be in the journey. I would have had the journey I would have had it not been for that, because it had such a paramount impact on who I was in my development process for not only a content creator, but also at the same time, like getting back into reading and diving into like things like mythology and lore and a lot of stuff like that, and a lot of other mediums that I was really ignorant and really a novice of. And now I can say that I can hold a conversation about. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an expert, but I could hold a conversation, and it like really has impacted me as a creative, which has allowed me to give me a brand new love for things that I didn't have before.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have some of my best friends had it not been for that I have in my life now, if it wasn't for that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a beautiful thing when you realize the power that this specific genre of music can have, because it capitalizes. It capitalizes on a situation that already taps into primal fears or core feelings or key traumas or these different things. And it's just like it's already primed you to be in that posture. And then you get hit with this music, this moment. And it just lights up your brain like a Christmas tree. You know what I mean? And that's, yes, there's so much of that can be said about horror and things like that. But the Man of Steel score is absolutely amazing. And yeah, say what you will about Zack Snyder and the DCU and the whole 9 yards. Say what you will, but if nothing else, if you cannot stand the movie and what happens in it or any of those kinds of things, that score is so, like, you're talking about some of the best of an IP that has some of the best that cinematic music has to offer. But and my version of that what you're talking about, it's the Rocky soundtrack. Yeah, it's cliche. I'm from Philly, but it's okay. We all have to be a cliche at some point in our lives. But there's like Eye of the Tiger, right? Like, I still train to Eye of the Tiger, because when every single moment of me like losing all of the weight that I did and being able to walk back the diagnosis that I was given, and all of that determination and all of that time and that effort that was put into all of that was the soundtrack of those moments. That was the soundtrack of those years of my life that were spent going towards this goal. And so, yeah, I listen to Going the Distance. I listen to Hearts on Fire. I listen to Eye of the Tiger, and those are the things that are going through my mind, because I've tied that period of time, I've tied that feeling, I've tied that experience to that music. So everything that we're talking about from the horror side, I understand not everybody that's going to be listening to this is going to be of the Christian worldview, but I understand that for folks that have that Christian worldview, that could be a weird thing to try and reconcile, that two people that are professing are sitting here talking about those things, but try to take yourself out of it being about the horror of it all, and try to take yourself to a Man of Steel, to a Rocky, to any of these famous scores that are generally accepted, Lord of the Rings, 300, any of them that are generally accepted, and ask yourself, what makes you so connected to that music? And just realize that it's just that particular flavor of it.
Yeah, I think that's really well spoken. And I don't have anything to add except that, I've every so often I'll get people to ask me how I can profess to be a Christian and still watch horror, read it, or, listen to podcasts about it, or, dive into anything related to this genre. And for me, I've always kind of said that there's this openness to horror. Like, horror is not just blood and guts. It's not just, demons and bad guys. It is this constant conversation that's happening of processing trauma, or, being goofy, or, having those gateways. Like, there's a number of things that I would classify as horror that people would be like, oh, this is all ages. Like, that's gateway horror. If you grew up in the 90s, you grew up on things like Are You Afraid of the Dark, Halloween Town, Goosebumps, Don't Look Under the Bed, My Mom's Dated a Vampire, or something like that. Like, there are a number of these things, Hocus Pocus, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, that are they're essentially entryways into this genre. But at the same time, like, when it comes to more of these, I don't know if we were going to get here, but maybe we will. When you get into more of the things of the church, and things like conversations like sex, like mental health, like depression, like suicide, like the afterlife, there seems to be these very hands-off topics that, even though scripture addresses it, we as the church feel like we shouldn't address it because it's going to step on people's toes. It's going to make them uncomfortable. And a part of horror is that it makes you uncomfortable. It brings that conversation to the table. Even if it's not getting it scripturally or biblically accurate, that is, as Christians, that is our chance to step in and bring Christ to the conversation, even if it is, especially if it's to non-believers, or those that are outside the church, or those that have been hurt by the church, bringing that familiarity of something like Halloween, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, or Child's Play, or Hellraiser, or The Exorcist, and bring them into the conversation of scripture and what the Bible says, what Jesus teaches on this. I've always told people that, for me, The Exorcist isn't a movie about a young girl that gets possessed and brings a demon into the world. When you look at that, whether you're talking about the book or you're talking about the movie, it is about a priest that experiences one of the hardest losses that he'll ever experience. So much so that he questions the very thing he's dedicated his life to, the relationship with God, and ultimately ends up finding truth of the afterlife, past eternity. And it's this question of faith. Again, a conversation that we don't have too much. I feel like that's another podcast, though.
It's one of those things that the like you said, the beauty of horror is that it opens the door. It allows the conversation to begin. And when you're talking about the trauma that's associated with any of these topics and things like that, the question I come back with when I watch the fear that some people have with addressing this, or the unwillingness to go here and things like that, then the question I ask is how can we really and fully and truly love our neighbor if we are so unwilling to go into that aspect of the conversation, those topics of the conversation? Because these are all things that, yeah, sure, some of them are more exaggerated, some of them are more fanciful, some of them have a supernatural component to them for the sake of the movie and things like that. Yeah, sure. But when you boil it down, there's so many components of horror that are just extensions of very real evil that exists in this world. And I don't necessarily mean that from like a purely supernatural perspective when I say evil. You know, there are evil acts that person does to person on a regular basis. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that in order to be in the midst of these conversations, we have to be willing to allow ourselves to convey love, convey truth, even in these areas, but that also requires an ability to be able to discern content. There are things I will never ask somebody to go beyond what their conviction is. If they cannot handle it, then don't do it. This isn't a call for everybody and their mother to go out and watch every horror movie or anything else like that. But there should be a there should be a level of discernment that allows for you to be able to approach media, even if it's not media made with the same worldview that you have.
I always like to tell people too, like, horror is like part of my story. You know, it's part of the testimony that I have, where like when I initially like was getting into the genre, because I grew up pretty conservative Christian household, and you didn't watch things like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, or you didn't watch those, or April Fool's Day. You know, Jaws was like the level that you kind of like got when it came to like horror. That was it. That was the ceiling. And so when I turned 18 and like I was able to get a Blockbuster card, I was like, I'm gonna go after John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Alfred Hitchcock. I'm gonna jump into like all of these greats, because I was a cinephile. You know, I wanted to see all these films that I had heard about all these years, and I got so emotionally obsessed and attached to these characters that the slasher genre became something that I really loved and that I really valued, so much so that when I'd have violent outbursts, I would withdraw myself and I would go and I would watch, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or, something brutal. And I would just kind of decompress and say, I am the killer. This person, this victim is the source of my anger right now. And there became a day where the Lord was like, give it up. And that was it. And like, I sold every movie I had. I sold every comic I had. Anything it had that touched the horror genre. Like I gave it away. And so a few years passed and the Lord really healed me, really broke me. I had a lot of like amendments that I had to do. And so like I had a lot of uncomfortable conversations and phone calls that I called to people and said, hey, like I was going through this. This is how you made me feel. I'm really sorry. And I remember one day I was sitting in my prayer and I was like, I really want to watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Lord, if you feel like I'm at a place with peace in this, and like I have a firm understanding of like where I'm supposed to be, then you'll let me watch it. And I felt peace and I was like, go forth and watch it. And I just jumped in and like slowly started getting back into the genre. And over the last couple of years, like the Lord has really brought me to a place where like I know my emotional limit now, not to, and that's why I always tell people it's like like Paul says, like everything is good, but not everything is permissible. Not everything. Like, I think that's how it goes.
Everything is permissible, but not everything is good.
Yeah, got it backwards. And so it takes everything in moderation. But like you're saying, Joe, like take and understand your boundaries and like define those for yourself. Like say like, all right, like I'm going to watch genre, but I'm not going to watch anything that's rated R. Or I'm going to watch horror, but not anything that has sex in it. Or I'm going to watch horror, but not anything that, is super bloody or super graphic, or, really set those limits for yourself. Because like we've been saying this entire time, is that horror is one of those things that is so multifaceted. It can literally be anything. If you're into sci-fi, there's a subgenre for that. If you're wanting to kind of get your, like understand like monsters, there's an entire like genre of that. And like, Godzilla and Frankenstein and Creature from the Black Lagoon, like there's so many different facets to the genre. And I think that it just gets a bad rap just because of all of these misunderstandings that the church has when it comes specifically to it.
Yeah. It's so for me, my big cutoff is, after my son passed away, violence toward children. Nope, absolutely not. You will lose me and I'm done. But likewise, addressing it, like even being able to have a conversation about it after he passed, all of that was because of my time watching horror. Now, mind you, my story is a little bit different as far as how long I've been a Christian and all of that sort of thing. Did not grow up in a Christian household and all of that. And so I was exposed really, really young, but so it was always kind of there for me, but being able to address the realities of the situations really helped me to be able to at least open myself up to this idea of making peace with what happened in a way that just at least allowed me to be able to step forward when I say peace, like one foot in front of the other sort of thing. But seriously, like that's understanding what your limitations are and understanding what you vibe with and what flavor you appreciate, and all of that is so much of the journey as far as getting into horror or finding a comfortable spot or any of those kinds of things. And the artistry of it is just kind of lost when you just paint it all as bad, or you just paint it all as one particular flavor or things like that. Yeah, some of this stuff is not high cinema or strong storytelling, but some of it is great,
Yeah, and that's like, it's one of those things that it's like, it's not everything that we say is black and white really is black and white, and it's very much gray, and it's complex, and the horror genre and all of its music and icons, everything is very much that way. Like, I think if you leave here with one thing, with nothing else, like I would suggest like enter into it with like openness, an open mind, because I think that, even if you don't make it past the 1950s, I think there are so many incredible films, whether you're talking about Nosferatu or Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein or Godzilla, that are just incredible, or The Invisible Man, there's incredible pieces of what this genre is capable of.
Yeah.
And again, it's not black and white, it's gray. I just want to throw that out there.
So speaking of Nosferatu and how resonant some movies can be, so the missus and I went out yesterday actually to go see these. It's the first in a series of movies that this independent art house is putting out just to independent theaters, and we happen to have one near us. And this was Nosferatu with Radiohead cut in as the background soundtrack, and they did some stuff with cutting in some they did some stuff with cutting in color a little bit here and there. Like it was beautiful. And 100% I'm by. I love Radiohead. I think Radiohead is a great band. But to watch a movie that of the time was addressing a plague, to watch that post 2020 was a wild experience to see so much of it. Oh, dude, so much of it was thematic. Like in a, did we learn anything over the course of 100 years sort of thing in certain regards, but that's its own conversation and podcast. But it's this beautifully somber and macabre background to a movie that doesn't shy away from addressing things like anxiety and stuff like that. Is it a byproduct of its time in the way that it treats women and the way that it talks about those things? Yes, it is. Like understand that when you're going into these movies. Same thing with the Frankenstein, Mummy, any of the Universal stuff, any of the Hammer horror stuff, all of that, that's all a byproduct of its time. And if you can work your way through those components, there's still really resonant stories to be told, but talk about an entirely new look at this movie to have Radiohead playing the whole time. My only complaint is I really thought that they were going to have the scene where, you see the monster shadow going up the stair. Come on, creep. Hello. Like that could have been such a good scene, but they picked more of their like ethereal work and stuff like that. And I think it was such a clever way to revitalize a classic.
That's awesome. I'm super jealous. I don't know if I'll ever get to see that, but that sounds dope.
Yeah.
AF.
Yeah. So I wanted to give you the floor for a few to talk about some of the horror themed bands that are out there, some of those kinds of bands that kind of flutter around this particular topic and stuff like that. We did bring up Ice Nine Kills, but talk about some of that stuff.
Yeah, so I will say Ice Nine Kills is like 100% the way to go. I mean, everything that they've made in the last 10 years is all horror themed, whether that is their own, whether they're taking and weaving in their own storylines, because they've I don't know if you know this, they have graphic novels and all of their music videos are like movies. Like they're way into like the horror, and they're so smart about how they do it. But even before they got into movies, like, every trick in the book like addressed was jumping into like horror stories, to where they talked about like Carrie and what's that Orwell Pig Farm, Animal Farm, but then they had the predator becomes the prey, and so they've done for a long time. Motionless in White is another one that I will throw in there.
Oh, that's awesome.
Into that conversation. They're not quite as thematic as Ice Nine, but they definitely have a lot of those like horror and horror themed vibes. I mean, Creatures, their entire first one is very heavy on, things like the Salem witch trials and, vampires and stuff like that. So they are definitely one that I would recommend. The Funeral Portrait is kind of a newer band that's coming up, that's rising up. Dark Divine is another new one that's coming up. They're very horror themed, especially Dark Divine. Yeah, those are the ones that like I would say are like in regular rotation for me that like I'm aware of, but I know that there's probably a couple other ones that are like also worth mentioning that I'm probably forgetting.
A couple that are a little bit more of the like one-off single or not necessarily as heavy. For Our Last Night does a couple of covers of some horror stuff. They were one of the two covers that I heard of This Is Halloween that I absolutely love. And Lyric Noel is another one that you can find on YouTube pretty easily that has just a really cool presentation with how she covers this stuff. It was like drinking out of a fire hose when I first found Ice Nine, and I'm gonna have to go back and listen to more of Motionless in White because it's just been a long time since I've heard their stuff, but I didn't realize some of those connections that you had brought out. But again, not like, wouldn't call myself like necessarily a particular fan, but I definitely feel like they're worth a revisit, you know.
And I would be remiss and canceled if I did not give love. Throw this out there since I am from their hometown. Gwar is also definitely one worth throwing out there. And I will also say that if you have Shudder, check out the Gwar documentary that they put out 2 years ago. I listen to this band on occasion.
Yeah.
But I cried by the end of that movie. It was very, very.
Yeah. Yeah. I had an opportunity to see Gwar once when I was younger. And it was just a wild experience. Like, not that I don't like listen to their stuff on the reg or anything, but they're another one that's very much. They very much try to bring in a wholesale experience rather than just a musical concert.
Yeah, that's something that, you know, and obviously other bands, we talked about Rob Zombie. Obviously Misfits are a big one to talk about. Other bands, you know, that I would also talk about, Ghost obviously being a huge one.
Yep.
And of course, bands like Slipknot and Marilyn Manson, obviously, as well.
Yeah. Slipknot's one that I've definitely grown out of. I used to be a huge Corey Taylor fan. I used to be obsessed with Slipknot. And don't get me wrong, I'll still get down to some of their stuff every once in a while. I feel like some of my musical tastes have evolved a little bit since when I listened to them really at like my peak, but they're another one that just puts on a killer show live. I've seen them live 3 times now, and each time has been really good.
Yeah. I will also say maybe not like their studio stuff, but if you ever see them live, In This Moment definitely has a lot of like emphasis on costumes and horror and stuff like that. It very much feels like a Halloween show.
Yeah. I love In This Moment. I think they are a band that I think they have a lot of uniqueness, and I have been guilty many a time of preferring things that are unique, even if they're not necessarily as popular or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I vibe with that.
So, man, we could go for another several hours, I am sure. But before we wrap this thing up and get out of here for the next ones to take over for the next episode, please let people know the stuff that you've got going on, the shows, the whole nine.
Yeah, so we have quite a lot. When we say that we are multimedia, we do everything now from live music events, Comic-Cons, horror cons, film festivals, so all that stuff. But it's all done with the emphasis to destigmatize and educate people on mental health through the familiarity of pop culture. So if you guys go to victimsandvillains.net, it will give you guys episodes to all of our podcasts, past and present, which include everything from the podcast that started all, Victims and Villains, our pop culture podcast now, Brilliant But Lazy, the other podcast I host called That's High Praise, a Nicolas Cage podcast, Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast, as well as all of our movie reviews, social media, and where we're going to be in the future. Maybe we're coming near to a city near you. But most importantly, if you go to our website, you will most importantly find our mental health resource library. That again is victimsandvillains.net.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And you can find me over on YouTube at Thoughts from a Bearded Geek, as well as Shell Shock, a TMNT series. And if you look up KFM Broadcasting, that is where all of the ministry related stuff lives as well. Guys, it has been a blast. Happy Halloween. Stay spooky. Peace, y'all.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Some Joyful Noises, a proud member of the Anazal Podcast Network. You can listen to other Anazal podcasts with the link that's down below in this show's description. If you have ideas for this show or would like to lead one of these episodes, then you can email us at anazalministriespodcast@gmail.com and pitch an idea to us, and we'll talk about it and see whether or not we can make it work for you to lead your own episode. We hope to hear from you soon, and that you'll help us keep it noisy.